warm welcome to our fourth TEPoP event of this year, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Nikki Newton, for anyone who doesn't know me. I'm Senior Biodiversity Evidence Specialist at JNCC. So the event today is an event of two parts, really. The first is looking at the work that will be undertaken by the TSDA partnership this year. Lots of acronyms today. So TSDA is the Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis Partnership, and it's a partnership which aims to work innovatively to support the development of current and future UK terrestrial biodiversity monitoring schemes and the analysis of their data. And that's with the aim to enable schemes to effectively engage citizen scientists and volunteers to contribute to our understanding of UK nature recovery. So that's the first part, and the second part we'll be looking at equality, diversity and inclusion in volunteer surveillance schemes. And this has been a focus for the last couple of years within JNCC and more broadly across volunteer networks. We've had some really good events on this in recent years. So we had a good workshop in 2020 and then some talks last year from scheme partners looking at how they were working towards breaking down barriers to inclusion. So that following previous year's events, this year we're thinking about what's been happening over the last year in relation to EDI and schemes, and thinking a bit more about sort of strategic direction for EDI. So we will be recording today's event and adding it to YouTube, along with the recordings of all the other talks in the TEPoP Festival from this year and previous years. So we've got lots of speakers to hear from today, and lots of exciting pieces of work. So thanks for coming along. So, as I said, this is the fourth event in this year's programme of events on TEPoP strategy, including those two areas I've outlined. We've had three previously, and there will be on YouTube soon, and we have a fifth event in a couple of weeks, which we'll talk about today and give you joining details for that if you're interested in coming to that. And there'll also be written summary outputs available from across the festival in due course. So just a reminder, I expect everybody here does know what TEPoP is, but it's the UK Terrestrial Evidence Partnership of Partnerships. So essentially all the organisations in the box on the left fund, organise, run and steer a range of structured and unstructured biodiversity data collection as listed in the box on the right. And really we're aiming to come together to collaborate and exchange knowledge so we can try and work more efficiently and more effectively. And we're keen to sort of expand this network to work across the terrestrial monitoring environment. So welcome to everybody here. We've got an email, and if you want to be added to our TEPoP bulletin, which is a quarterly bulletin, if you want to be added to that mailing list, then please do email the address that's on the screen now, and you'll get quarterly updates on what's going on and things like advertisements for this event and events like it. So what's on our agenda today? As I say, lots of different shorter and longer talks, and mix of discussion sessions as well. So we've got a brief introduction from me now, and then Michael is going to tell us about TSDA strategy, a bit on sort of past and present and future. And then I'll talk a bit more about ways of working in TSDA going forward. We've then got a series of sort of 5-minute quick-fire talks on TSDA tasks that we're going to be undertaking this year, and we'll then have an opportunity for some questions and comments and sort of next steps. We'll have a quick break then, and then we'll go into the EDI section of the day, and we're going to be hearing from 3 schemes who have undertaken demographic surveys on their volunteers this year. And then I'll say a bit about JNCC's perspective on EDI in schemes. And then we've got a couple of one activity on Jamboard and a short discussion session before we feed back on that and then come to a close just in time for lunch. So as I've said, we will be using Jamboard today. I think Hannah is going to share a link in the chat now to that. It's got quite a lot of pages which you can scroll through using the little button at the top of the Jamboard screen. The first screen that will pop up, or sort of Jamboard number one, is where we'd love you to put any questions that you've got on the first couple of talks from me and Michael. Any sort of questions or comments or thoughts that you want to express there. And you can add post-it notes to the board using, I think it's the fourth button down on the sort of side toolbar. But one of the most important things is don't press the clear frame button, because that clears the screen. Yeah, please feel free to put down any thoughts there. And if we can't address them today, then we'll think about them going forward and try and answer them following that. So I'm going to hand over to Michael now, I think. We're really excited to be involved with the TSDA partnership going forward in JNCC, and we're really keen to support the TEPoP schemes in a kind of useful and impactful way using it. So I'll be talking more about how we hope to do this in a few minutes after we hear from Michael. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you ever so much, Nikki. So if you'd like to go on to the next slide.
Yes. There we go.
Thank you. So as Nikki said, TSDA, which I think many of you will have at least some familiarity with, is a partnership across JNCC, UKCH and BTO. And there's been a previous 5 years of it, and we've just started the second 5-year period, which was a result of us coming together through, or at least CH and BTO coming together through open competition. So as a reminder, it stands for Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis, which is a bit of a mouthful, but there we go, that's where we are. And so we've had 5 years of the TSDA partnership with the same 3 partners. And during those last 5 years, we've achieved a lot of different things. And one of the key things was that right at the beginning of TSDA 1, as I've called it, was that we did a needs assessment for biodiversity data. And this was across governmental organisations. So in that sense, we were particularly focusing on the funders and that user group of data. And so we looked across all these different needs, and you can see there from that fairly complicated diagram on the right, I'm going to say the thing that I always hate people saying, you don't need to read all the detail, but it just shows the richness of the different reports and the outputs that we've had across that particular project. What we did was we tried to address some of the key needs which were raised during the needs assessment. So those are stated on the left-hand side there. So firstly, how do we better assess ecosystem state? We did a lot of work thinking about some of the work that needs to be done, thinking around the definition of ecosystem health and how we go from species to communities. We thought about how do we ensure that the indicators are more representative, so more taxa or better data, thinking about some of those FAIR principles to ensure that the data feeding into indicators are consistent across all the different taxa. We invested in new statistical methods, and in particular one was model-based integration, which is able to pull together different data. So in particular, in our case, we were thinking about structured data or data from structured schemes and data from unstructured or less structured schemes, and bringing them together to be able to get the benefits of both. Fourthly, there we were looking about adding value from the volunteer network, in particular thinking about habitat recording and effort recording. And finally, we were thinking about using the data to predict future changes by assessing the impact of interventions. For example, we spent quite a bit of work focusing on protected areas. Through this all, what the aim of this was to try and provide some overarching, I suppose, overarching influence, guidance, support, use of scheme data and support for the different schemes, many of which are represented here. So can you go on to the next slide, please, Nikki? Thank you. So as I said, we were informed by the stakeholder needs assessment. We produced many different reports. We produced a lot of different outputs, some of which are peer-reviewed papers or going through that process as well. And I think within TSDA 1, we were particularly strong at evaluating problems and in scoping potential solutions. So we did a lot of work thinking about, for example, ecosystem health and the challenges involved with defining ecosystem health was. But going forward into TSDA 2, we wanted to slightly change some of the emphasis within the sorts of work that we were doing. So can you go on, please, Nikki? So the background of TSDA 2 is we had this amazing 5 years worth of partnership work, working with agencies and with many of these different schemes as well. Looking about how we can add value both to the data and also to the volunteer networks. But the background of TSDA 2 is thinking more, I suppose more focusedly about bending the curve of biodiversity loss. JNCC and other agencies were involved in this report, thinking about Nature Positive 2030. We know that we are in this critical biodiversity crisis, and it also really does feel like the time is now in order to take the opportunities that we've got, working with government agencies and seeking to change this trajectory for biodiversity loss. We've got things like the targets under the Office for Environmental Protection, various things like this. It feels like the time is now when things are beginning to come together. Of course, there's also this continued investment in the volunteer recording schemes. So I've got a few of them represented here, going from the really long-standing ones. Butterfly monitoring scheme, breeding bird survey have been running for a long time, right the way through to things like the pollinator monitoring scheme, national plant monitoring scheme, which had just been established over the past few years and just beginning to deliver in terms of the data for those particular schemes. So each of these schemes are standalone, they work well in their own right. And so as TSDA, we were thinking, well, actually, how can we add value to the work that's being done here in terms of thinking about support for volunteers and so on? So can you go on, please? So thinking ahead for the coming 5 years, our vision is to support the portfolio of TEPoP schemes in providing evidence to support a nature positive future, adding value to existing data through cross-scheme analysis and by developing analytical and volunteer capacity. And one of the key things that we want to do is think about the way that we work. And we want to do this in a much more strongly, I suppose, action-orientated or solutions-focused approach. So, for example, within TSDA 1, I think we worked well at thinking about, is recording spatially biased? And we began to think more about when and how does spatial bias matter? In TSDA 2, what we want to do is keep moving through that cycle to be asking, well, when it matters, what can we do? And be thinking both about the analytical approaches and volunteer engagements. That's a fairly simple example. But through this all, we want to be able to go through this cycle of reflecting on what maybe the problems are or the challenges or limitations are, planning for those options for solutions, acting, which might be testing or piloting solutions, where it might be working with one scheme or a couple of schemes in order to develop ideas, and then evaluate the difference that meant. We also want to engage with stakeholders so that's you, throughout this whole process, and use this as a platform for developing further innovative research as well. So in terms of the engagement with stakeholders, that's you, whether you're from an agency representing a country in the UK, or whether it's someone from a scheme, one of the TEPoP schemes. And so we've set these up under 3 grand challenges, which I'll run through now. Next slide talks about the first grand challenge, which is about the need for us to adapt to new requirements for evidence. For example, we know that we've got increasing targets which are being set by government. And so how can we operationalise the use of TEPoP scheme data to assess progress against those targets? We're also thinking about the future and thinking about using, I think we're really good at using scheme data to assess changes in the past, but how can we use that to then predict the scale of the changes that we're going to need in the future to be nature positive? How can we also use the data to downscale to the policy relevant scales? So certainly within the individual countries of the UK, but even within areas, within regions of those countries as well. And the definition of ecosystem health is really challenging. I know that it's a concept that lots of people agree with, but actually, how do we nail that down, and how do we operationalise that in using the scheme data to provide that richer, broader assessment of ecosystem health? And the second one is thinking about new data streams. So we know that there's new data becoming available via sensors or eDNA, and how can that be sensibly incorporated into TEPoP schemes and the flow of data through TEPoP schemes? That may be thinking about how we can better use the volunteers, or not use the volunteers, but work with the volunteers within the schemes in order to apply some of this new technology. We might need to think more about the metadata from the data from these new data streams and how that needs to be developed in order to incorporate that within our data. How can we develop schemes that actually benefit from both the existing volunteer data, which is so incredibly valuable, while also adding value through bringing in these new data streams as well, which might be the combination of structured and unstructured, or might be the combination of structured versus eDNA, or whatever it might be. But thirdly, what we wanted to do as well is put volunteers as the third grand challenge, Nikki, is to bring volunteers front and centre to what we're trying to do. And so we want to develop this volunteer-centred approach. So making that foundational, the co-design with volunteers foundational to what we're trying to do, rather than simply proposing possible solutions and leaving it there. We want to take it further with them. Examples of that could be providing more personalised feedback to volunteers on the value of their recording, thinking about better methods for operationalising this capture of recording effort, or incorporating expert knowledge into analyses. And so finally, we're also aware that what we want is we want our work to be, because it's solutions focused, we need to be thinking, and we are thinking more about the engagement. So we need your help to help shape TSDA to meet your needs. And so co-design with you is important, as well as with volunteers. And we're looking at this from the point of view of both the short-term benefits, the things that might be able to be implemented in the next couple of years, but also the longer term benefits, and looking at the sorts of things which will build our capacity, both as the network of TEPoP schemes, but also as a community going forward. So build our capacity for the growth of biodiversity monitoring for the future. So as we go through some of the specific activities, it would be great for you to be able to think about how you can be involved in this. And also, as we think about communication and dissemination, we want to be guided by you about what makes sense for the way in which you would like to receive some of the insight that we've been able to develop during TSDA. So I'll leave it there, Nikki, and let you take things on.
Thanks, Michael. Just get the screen back up. Okay, so thanks very much to Michael for that great summary of where we're at with sort of strategic thinking. I just have a couple of slides here around sort of ways of working that we'd like to try this year, sort of following up on from what Michael was just saying around engagement with you as TEPoP, because you are fundamentally very integral to the work that we do, being heavily involved in leading and steering the surveillance schemes. So the way that we'd like to try this year in terms of trying to open those avenues for engagement with you. So we've got 6 TSDA tasks running up to the end of this financial year, although some of these may extend beyond this to next September, because the TSDA year is running sort of September to September. And we may have a couple more tasks starting next April as well. So there's potentially some opportunities for you to express any thoughts on sort of work priorities for TSDA across TEPoP, which might help to steer what those additional couple of tasks that start next April might be. Would be really interested to hear about what any thoughts you have on that on the Jamboard, or at any other point you want to talk about them. So the tasks that we've got running, we've tried to keep to fewer tasks than we maybe had running concurrently previously in TSDA, to try and keep it a bit more focused in terms of engagement, and run the tasks probably a little bit more like a sort of task and finish groups in terms of trying to keep them quite concise. So with that in mind, we'd like to try running sort of task group meetings, sort of short meetings every maybe 4 to 6 weeks, to try and keep the engagement ongoing throughout the task. And we recognise that people may want to be engaged with the tasks to different extents. So you might be really enthusiastic about getting really involved and being involved in sort of data interpretation, or maybe you'd like to sort of review papers or outputs when they are produced, or maybe you'd just like to be a bit more sort of passively looking at results as they come out and being kept in the loop as to what's happening in each different task area. So there's this sort of spectrum that's sort of represented between active collaborators and then down to interested in outputs. And on the Jamboard, slides 2 to I think 7 have a page per task that will be presented in a minute, and on the left hand side there's a section for you to pop a post-it note to express where you might like to be involved. There's no pressure to do it now, because there are going to be other opportunities to find out more about the task, but if you want to put your cards on the table and express some interest early on, then we'd love to hear from you. So generally, as Michael said, we really want to kind of increase the awareness of the TSDA tasks that are going on, and crucially enhance their impact, and that really will be dependent on working with you all. So hopefully you'll be enthused about what you're going to hear about coming up. So just a bit of a timeline as to how we envisage or hope this process might work. Today we've got about 30-35 minutes to just give you a brief introduction to the tasks, and as I said, we've got a Jamboard per task where please just write whatever you want about it. I mean, please be nice, but add your comments or questions or any points of interest. And we will have a Q&A session later on to answer some of these, but we might not get to all of them. but we will try and talk about them all in the future. So after the event today, we've left a couple of weeks for you to hopefully go away and have a bit of a think about the tasks and think about whether you might be interested in getting involved in some of them, or whether you've got any colleagues who maybe aren't here today who might be enthusiastic about getting involved or hearing about what comes out of the tasks. And we will share a link to an event which we're holding on the 21st of November from 10 till 1, where we're going to have sort of half-hour drop-in sessions, one for each task. So there's no pressure to come to the whole 3-hour event, just come along to the half an hour or more of whatever you're interested in. And that will be a further opportunity just to ask questions, talk through anything that was outstanding on the Jamboard, bring new people into the discussions, and work out whether you want to sort of be involved in these task groups going forward. So please do share the link to that event with your colleagues after today's event appropriately, as you think they might be interested. So then by the end of the event on the 21st of November, we're hoping to have generated sort of task mailing lists for this longer term engagement, such that we can keep you all involved as you want to be in this, to the degree of interest that you have. So I think that's all I wanted to say about the sort of ways of working. As I say, there's a space on the Jamboard for you to ask any questions or make any comments about this proposal. But I think we're about ready to move on to hearing about the TSDA tasks. So these talks loosely follow this sort of structure, and in kind of 5 minutes per task, we'll try to outline what we're aiming to achieve in the task, how we're planning on going about it, and why might you be interested in it and want to be involved in the process. So I think it's time to hand over to Maddie now. Hopefully Maddie's online. Are you there, Maddie?
Hi, yep, I'm here.
Great. Would you like to kick us off with the first of these talks then, please?
Brilliant. So this task is about habitat recording, and the key aim that we're trying to achieve through this task is about extending. Oh, can you see the slides? Yeah, okay. So it's aiming to understand volunteer motivations for recording habitat data alongside species surveillance scheme data. And the key difference that we hope to make with this work is around the validation of Earth observation data. So in terms of how this links into TSDA's aims, the TSDA strategy had 3 key challenges. Challenge 1 was around adapting to new requirements for evidence, and understanding, having ground truthing data to validate Earth observation data is an example of a relatively new data gap or evidence requirement. In terms of this, there have been significant developments in EO capabilities in recent years, which can help to improve our understanding of environmental dynamics. But for these to work, field data recording habitat is needed to train the models and validate them. The second challenge in the strategy relates to exploiting new data streams. It outlines a vision for TSDA to understand the feasibility of potential development of species surveillance schemes, including recording additional parameters, such as habitat data. It also talks about understanding potential impacts on volunteer motivations of these add-ons. So surveying volunteers to understand their thoughts on collecting habitat data as a potential add-on is therefore also very relevant to this challenge. And in a similar vein, the way it will take on volunteers' thoughts on the topic through the surveys is also directly relevant to Challenge 3, around developing a volunteer-centred approach to the evolution of TEPoP schemes. Next slide. So this task, we split this task into 3 sections to be undertaken this year and next. And we're currently in discussions with scheme leads to establish which schemes would like to participate, how, etc. The first task involves designing and circulating 2 surveys to volunteers who are currently involved in TEPoP recording. One of these surveys will explore volunteer interests, motivations, confidence, training requirements, and preferred feedback in relation to recording habitat attributes that could be useful for EO validation. And the other survey will be designed to capture feedback and user experiences of the EarthTrack app, which volunteers will be invited to trial. EarthTrack is an app that's been specifically developed to facilitate ground level collection of land cover, habitats and change to support routine and continuous mapping and monitoring of landscapes from Earth observation data. We'll then collate and analyse the results from the surveys and discuss implications of these with the scheme leads. We'll draw conclusions from these on whether we want to take this work forward into another phase, and if so, what the most appropriate approaches to do so would be. And finally, we'll also include in the survey a question to understand whether there would be interest from volunteers in informing specific focus groups to trial any potential add-ons in future. Next slide, please. If the surveys showed interest in recording habitat data and the work were taken forward beyond this phase, previous TSDA work has identified a number of advantages that recording habitat data for EODIT validation could bring to schemes in terms of the impact and range of use cases that scheme data can contribute towards. Accurate habitat information improves the UK's ability to protect, manage and restore sites at both local and national scales. Continuously monitoring habitat extent and condition through the regular generation of national habitat maps through ground truth observation can help identify areas of change, help to evaluate the success of management strategies, and facilitate adaptive management protocols. Updated national habitat maps can also contribute to an improved understanding of species habitat associations, with potential to feed into predictive species modelling, thereby helping to progress towards species protection goals by providing updated estimates of area of available habitat. Discussions at the UK TEPoP 2018 workshop suggested improved habitat data could help to validate species records and contribute to scheme survey design. For example, EO-based habitat maps could help to develop stratified site selection or target high-risk areas such as those flagged as changed in both structured and unstructured recording schemes. A range of species-related applications of habitat data were also identified by workshop attendees, including evaluating drivers of change and associated pressures, informing stratification of surveys, studying links between species, habitats and features, and measuring species responses to different landscape configurations. Thanks, back to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Maddie. That was great. Don't forget the Jamboard is there for any questions. So Maddie's is on page 2 of the Jamboard. I think we're passing over to Diana now. You're there, Diana?
Yeah, I'm here.
Just juggling windows. There we go.
Great, thanks. Okay, yeah, thanks, Nikki. So this task will be about how we can deal with the uneven spatial coverage that we know we have with species records. And it naturally follows from some of the tasks that were done under the previous TSDA that were looking at patterns in the availability of data geographically across the UK, and how we kind of communicate those spatial biases. Instead, in this task, we'll rather be thinking about solutions. So how can we account for the fact that we have uneven spatial coverage? So developing these solutions and filling in these gaps is important for many reasons, but especially because it'll help us make better use of the data that we have. For instance, we use the data for trend modelling to predict changes in species populations or distributions through time. But if we can improve the spatial coverage of the data, we can make these indicators more robust and more representative of what's happening across the broader environment. So the overall aim with this task is to provide some tools and recommendations to help improve spatial coverage of data and the derived indicators that use the data. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at this problem from 2 different angles. The first is looking at it in terms of simply a statistical problem. So if we start from the assumption that we will continue to have spatial bias and uneven spatial coverage, how can we try to account for that in our statistical models, for instance, in the trend models? The second way we'll look at this problem is rather from a kind of data collection point of view. So how can we improve data collection to fill in some of the data gaps and improve spatial coverage? So this would involve communicating where we need more data, so where it's undersampled, and how can we nudge recording towards those undersampled areas. And this is following on from work that was already been started previously. So you might remember the targeting revisits tool that's already been trialed and testing this idea. So in this next phase of TSDA, we'll compare both these approaches and consider both their challenges, their limitations, and when might one solution be more appropriate than the other for different types of spatial bias or different types of problems, or how we're going to use the data. So next slide, please. So yeah, going into a bit more detail about these two angles, which will each be aligned to a different subtask. The statistical solutions subtask will look to the much larger field of missing data theory. So we think of uneven spatial coverage as a problem for our particular field, but actually missing data gaps is a much broader problem that cuts across different kinds of questions, across different disciplines. And there's already been a lot of thinking about how you can account for it in analyses. So in this task, we'll review the whole range of tools that are used in different kinds of contexts and think about how they might transfer to our particular context of biodiversity monitoring. And we'll also trial some of these solutions in some case studies with different types of data gaps. For the second subtask on the data collection solutions, this will be following on from the trial of the targeting revisits tool. We'll look at the feedback that we got from the tool over the last year. And we'll look at records that were submitted and evaluate the success of the tool. So just to remind you of this tool, I've put an image here on the right. This was the targeting revisits map for grasshoppers, where the pink squares here highlighted where squares that would most benefit from recording, so where we were trying to nudge recording efforts. So yeah, this subtask will be evaluating the success of this approach and thinking about how we might expand the tool to more different taxonomic groups and schemes. Next slide, please. So yeah, we're really excited about this task. I hope it sounds interesting for you as well. Ultimately, we hope that the outcomes will be useful for the schemes by better communicating where we need more data, why we need more data in those places, better understanding of the range of solutions open to us, whether that's statistically or changing data collection, and ultimately improving the indicators that we produce with the data, so making them more robust and more representative of change in the world, well, in the UK. So we will organise some workshops at a later date to get more specific feedback on these tasks. So specifically the targeting revisits tool there'll be a workshop after Christmas to get your thoughts on how that worked over the last year. Okay, that's all from me. Handing back to Nikki.
Thanks very much, Diana. That was great. I think we're passing on to James now.
Morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And just wait for Nikki to put up those first slides. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you this morning. And what I'm going to do is just outline an element of the work that we're leading here at BTO, which is particularly to look at ways in which we can improve capacity for biodiversity surveillance in Northern Ireland. And it's very much got a Northern Ireland focus, but work that hopefully will be more broadly applicable as well. So to kind of illustrate the kind of scope of the problem or the challenge really that we're facing here, this bar graphs on the left-hand side illustrate the percentage of species for each country or region that we can produce trends for, separated by different taxa. For many taxa and for many regions, you're looking at about 40%. That's from either the butterfly monitoring scheme or the breeding bird survey and so on. But as highlighted here in the red circle, there's a real challenge there for Northern Ireland, and this is something that I know is a concern to ourselves from a BTO perspective. JNCC and DERA and NIEA in Northern Ireland. And if you click onto the next bit in relation to sort of again mapping this out, looking at this in a different way. This is data from the National Bat Monitoring Programme, again illustrating just by way of example of a number of you could have picked a number of different schemes, the reduced proportion of species in a particular location that we can produce trends for on a 10-kilometre resolution. And if you're not familiar with it, do have a look at that report led by Jenny Border that came out of the last TEPoP partnership that does provide that really nice overview of the coverage and what we can get from our existing JNCC terrestrial biodiversity surveillance schemes. So that's the kind of problem. What are we hoping to achieve with the next slide, please? So what we're looking to do is working with all of you, so from a kind of stakeholder perspective, but also from an NGO and a conservation organisation perspective, to map current biodiversity surveillance activities within Northern Ireland, or even if you're not working in Northern Ireland or would like to kind of expand that work in Northern Ireland, understand what your ambition would be there. We want to understand the barriers and the opportunities that exist to increase the coverage of those surveillance schemes, and to really, as well as I said, summarise the evidence needs of stakeholders in Northern Ireland, whether that's from NIEA, from DERA, Ulster Wildlife, CEDA, and so, just to understand what those evidence needs are, and to put those evidence needs with kind of what people are doing or what organisations are doing together to co-develop a series of recommendations for next steps. And as I said, we're doing this in Northern Ireland with a particular focus because of the particular shortcomings in terms of data availability there. But I hope that the technique and the approaches that we used and the lessons learned will be more widely applicable. Next slide, please. So we're going to do this through a series of one-to-one interviews, as I said, to understand, particularly from an organisational perspective, what your ambitions are for working in Northern Ireland and what some of the barriers and challenges are. So as Nikki has said, if you feel you've got something useful to contribute, if you're working in Northern Ireland or would like to work in Northern Ireland and aren't, then do put your details into the Jamboard and we can follow that up with you. Next bit, please. And this builds on a live kind of questionnaire consultation that JNCC are leading on at the moment, particularly to understand the surveillance monitoring scheme data within Northern Ireland. So do, if you've received that, I think particularly it's gone to kind of government staff, do fill that in, and we can pick up on some of those responses to help us as well. Next slide, please. And then what we'll be able to do is compare those needs against current data availability, and we'll be looking to follow up later on in the winter with one or more workshops in Northern Ireland to actually discuss our initial findings from that consultation and to co-develop some potential suggested solutions, with an end point of producing a report with recommendations, as I said, that will be specific to Northern Ireland, but also hopefully with some lessons learned for the rest of the UK. And final slide, please. So I hope this is of interest, particularly if you're working in Northern Ireland or looking to work in Northern Ireland, around, to try and provide some useful information to help you do that, to learn from each other, to cooperate and collaborate further in our kind of collective challenges that we're addressing here, to identify those key gaps, barriers and opportunities for working. I should flag up as parallel to this, we've just initiated a project called the Ripple Project, working in Northern Ireland, which is specifically around trying to engage new audiences with wildlife and with nature. And it may be that there are other projects that you're doing, so we can kind of look to learn from each other there. And as I said, hopefully this will also be applicable to thinking about ways in which we can tackle some of the challenges that we face in some of other countries as well. So please do engage with us on this over the coming months, so that we can really work together across the sector to deliver the sort of maximum data and opportunities for volunteer engagement in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, James. That's great. I'm handing over to Paul Woodcock now. Thanks, Paul.
Hi. Sorry, trying to turn the camera on. Yeah, okay, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so the purpose of this bit of work really is to try to put together some more standardized ways of explaining how TEPoP schemes mitigate potential biases and how they ensure data quality. And hopefully doing that will help to ensure and maintain confidence in scheme data, and also reduce the amount of time that we need to take in responding to these kinds of questions and queries. The reason for doing it is TEPoP data are obviously important. They're used for a range of different purposes, but there are sometimes questions about biases, about confidence in the results, about data reliability, and so on. And obviously, individual schemes, everybody addresses this in some way, but different schemes do tend to explain things in different ways and in different places and different levels of technical detail sometimes as well. At the same time, there are changes in the people who are requiring scheme data and interested in using scheme data as new opportunities emerge. And what that can mean is that people who are interested in the schemes and don't necessarily have that much background in environmental citizen science and an understanding of why the data are produced in a robust way. So what this project is trying to do is, first of all, put together a fairly standard template for explaining how schemes mitigate potential biases, and then populate that for each scheme. So I'm imagining kind of a sort of a standardish template, but with scheme specific content. The other thing that we want to do is try and produce sort of a more general briefing note type document that explains how TEPoP schemes as a whole ensure data quality and mitigate biases and so on. And that would be probably targeted at a more general audience. If you go to the next slide, please. So I think quite a bit of this is already out there, and what this is really about probably is more just bringing that together and standardizing the way it's presented rather than creating a lot of new content. But we will also use a report that a NERC intern, Paddy Keith, did recently, looking at sort of how schemes mitigate biases and looking at it from a sort of an outside perspective. And we can share that report with anybody who's interested. I think the key bits in how we'll go about things is, first of all, trying to understand if anybody's got any particular concerns with this, any general thoughts on what approaches to take, and what people think are the main things to highlight and how that can be presented. So we've got this follow-up TEPoP event in a few weeks' time. Hopefully we can establish a group of sort of interested people following on from that, and then have a few discussions over the next few months to understand what each scheme thinks are important, what potential end users think is important, and agree a sort of a general template for how schemes can communicate the way that the biases are mitigated, and then following on from that, try and populate that template and try and produce this overall TEPoP briefing note. Next slide, please. So hopefully this will be useful. Hopefully it will, first of all, reduce the number of questions that come in about scheme data quality, and it will also hopefully reduce the amount of time that we need in responding to those, because we'll be able to sort of point to some standard documents rather than picking things from different places. Hopefully it will increase confidence in using scheme data, particularly amongst people who are maybe less familiar with environmental citizen science. And yeah, this is I know everybody's got loads of things on at the moment, but if you are able to help and contribute, that would be really appreciated, because I think that'll mean that we can take into account what you think the priority should be and any concerns you've got. I think also in TEPoP there is this breadth of expertise and ideas that will make any sort of document better, and I think if we can produce sort of a joint briefing note, that's going to have more weight than if it was just put together by one organisation. Thanks, Nikki.
All right, struggling to find my unmute button. Thanks, Paul. That was great. I think we're passing over to Nick Isaac now. Hopefully you've joined the call.
Hi.
Hi. Hiya.
So I'm going to give you a very quick tour of bending the curve. Bending the curve is this idea that biodiversity is in decline, and we want to change that declining trend into an increasing trend. The figure here sort of illustrates the concept that biodiversity, by whatever measure you choose, has been in decline. We've had various targets to improve that situation, and that has failed. And really, what the argument laid out in this paper is that we need a much clearer link between the targets, the improvement targets, and actions on the ground. And one way to do that and to think about the future is to have scenario modeling of the future projections, and that's what's on the right-hand side of this figure. And so this new piece of work that we're now starting under TSDA is about essentially how you do this. How do we produce these projections for the future and link targets for improving biodiversity to actions? So the next few slides, the next slide is an index of abundance for England, just showing you the pattern for England. And then the next slide after that is showing you the targets that England has already set up. Now I'm showing you England because England already has these targets written into the Environment Act. But as part of the Nature Positive initiative, the various agencies across the UK are working towards similar sorts of targets. So I'd be really interested to talk to those people in agencies who are involved in that discussion. The next slide shows you what the index would look like if we met those targets. That's the green line here, and the red is what would happen if we just carried on the historical trend. So you can see that we need to bend that curve. We need to do something different from what we've done in the past. We've had agri-environment schemes, we've had SSSIs, and it's led to a situation in which biodiversity has been declining. So we need to do something very, very different. And the scale of the ambition will become clear if you go into the next slide, which zooms in on that future trajectory, and that business as usual continued decline carries on into the future if we just simply extrapolate, and that the level of ambition required to turn the red line into the green line is really quite stark. So this is not a scenario, this is just a desired trajectory. So the scenarios really need to tell us, how do we get from the red line to the green line? And so the next slide is a sort of general introduction to scenario modeling. The left is a figure from quite an old figure actually, from IPCC, but the key is that underneath each of those coloured lines is a model of economic development, which links to a model of carbon emissions, which links to a model of global warming, and each of those steps is really clearly documented. The nearest thing that we've got for biodiversity is this figure on the right, which shows how some hypothetical biodiversity metric might change under some quite high level scenarios of the future. And so really what we're proposing under TSDA is to start operationalizing that for some metrics of biodiversity in the UK. The next slide is my sort of manifesto for action, and I don't really have time to talk about this, but the key is we need a lot of, there's a lot of work here to build the various elements. I've just tried to break it down here, but I think actually in the interest of time I'll skip on to the last slide, which is really our plans for the immediate future. So I think what we're trying to do is build a framework that allows us to make these kinds of projections, and sort of that really means putting a lot more flesh on the bones of the bullet points in the previous slide. And we need to look around at the kinds of data that's available. So we're going to have a workshop at some point, and a case study with SSSIs that builds upon work that we did last year under TSDA. How do we engage with you, and how was TEPoP people going to be interested? So I think people within the agencies, I'm really interested to talk to you more about what are the needs in terms of thinking about scenarios and targets. And people who are data providers, we're really interested to think about how we can better use data to make these kinds of models that would make them would allow us to make predictions of the future and with these targets in mind. I think that's probably all the time I've got.
Thanks very much, Nick. That was a great whistle-stop tour through quite a lot. But yeah, lots of interesting discussions to be had there. Our final talk is from Michael. So I'll pass back over to Michael now. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, deep breath. We're trying to do a lot across the TSDA partnership, and I would emphasise that although each of these activities have been presented by one person from one organisation, all of these activities involve different members of the partnership, and so we are working across organisation in order to benefit you, whether you're from an agency or whether you're from an NGO or conservation organisation. So the final activity that I'm going to be talking about is the one thinking about new technologies. And we do know that biological recorders have always been using new technologies, from binoculars, telescopes, microscopes, way back, through to apps, and now seeing things like the growth of sound recording. You can see the way in which people's enthusiasm for nature and nature recording has translated into them adopting new technologies in different ways. What we wanted to think about here is what are the new opportunities for these new technologies to support monitoring through the TEPoP schemes. How do we bring together data from different data streams, whether they be automated or the traditional volunteer-based recording? And so how can the new technologies add value to what we're existingly doing? And it might be the deployment of new hardware by existing volunteers. It might be that new applications, the sort of social media type of applications, and the way of harvesting data from there is a way of potentially engaging with new types of recorders and new audiences. So addresses some of those EDI issues, which we'll talk about in a bit. Maybe that there's new methods around personalized feedback and using technology and data science within that way, or the sort of AI tools, chatbots within Facebook forums. You've got a really wide range of technologies. And we wanted to think about these in terms of thinking about, well, how are these technologies acceptable or useful? Are they acceptable to schemes, both in terms of providing better data, but also in providing better engagement? If we go on to the next slide, the great thing is we don't have to spend loads and loads of time and effort trying to be creative, thinking about that horizon scanning for what the new technologies are going to be. There are already several projects which have been thinking about new technologies, either more in depth or very wide, in the context of biodiversity monitoring. And so people like myself, Diana Bowler, and Tom August have been involved in a range of different activities which have been looking at these sorts of things. So what we want to do is to collate the new technologies from these different reviews and different assessments which have gone on. We'll then need to look at defining scoring criteria to say how useful are these technologies for the schemes that we've got, the TEPoP schemes that we've got and support within the UK. So there are a few different scoring criteria there, possible ones. How do they engage new recorders? How well does the data map onto existing scheme data? How good are the technologies for filling spatial or temporal gaps, etc., etc. So come up with those scoring criteria and then score the technologies against these criteria. And in particular, we'll be thinking about the sort of readiness levels for how close these are to being implemented. And then on to the next slide. They may be, this work hopefully will be of interest to you, because the final stage that we'll do is to develop innovative use cases to explore where we can gain additional funding or where we can pilot these in future years and so build our capacity for biodiversity monitoring. So the question is for you, are you interested in thinking creatively? Are you interested in thinking about the future for biodiversity monitoring for your volunteers, or from the point of view of getting better data? And if you are, then do watch out for news to join the series of workshops which we'll be having to do this. We're going to make them exciting, we're going to make them interesting, and we'd love to have you involved. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. And yes, thanks for emphasising the partnership nature of working. That all partners are involved in all tasks, but each one has a lead partner. So we're now going. Before we go on to Q&A, I'll just speak about what I've got on the slides here. So as I mentioned, we've got this event on Monday, the 21st of November. Where we have opportunities for you to drop in and have further in-depth discussions about any or all of these tasks, however many that you want to be involved with. And we'd love to see you there and have a bit more of a chat about your thoughts, queries, concerns, anything really. So this is the programme for the day. We're going to share the joining details for this event in the chat here, so don't join it now because it's not happening yet, but do put it in your diary, and we'll circulate it around probably the TEPoP bulletin mailing list as well after this event. So if you're not on the TEPoP bulletin mailing list and you want these details, then drop us an email and we'll make sure you're on it and you get them as well. So it would be great to see as many of you there as possible. For now, we do have about 10 minutes for questions and thoughts from anybody. I think Hannah's going to chair this Q&A because she's not been manning the slides, so has hopefully had a chance to look at what the questions are. Yeah, do put your hands up or let us shout out your questions in an orderly fashion as we go. Over to Hannah.
Thanks, Nikki, and I will try. I think I'll start with the questions in the Jamboard, and then we can hand over to any folk who might want to raise their hand or put something in the chat. Starting back at the beginning, thinking about the strategy, the TSDA strategy, there was a question around whether or not terrestrial includes freshwater, and if it does, whether enough is being done through TEPoP and TSDA on freshwater biodiversity, noting the increased interest in freshwater citizen science. Nikki, I wonder, maybe that is back to you.
Yeah, well, I can take a stab at that, but any other partners are welcome to contribute as well. I think it's certainly not ruled out. I think the way that we've been thinking about it currently is thinking about sort of current interests within TEPoP schemes, but appreciate that freshwater is obviously very important as well. So if there was a clear priority with clear needs that came out for us to look at in association to it, then it certainly wouldn't be ruled out, I think. Nick and James.
So yeah, on the specifics of the bending the curve piece, freshwater is very much part of that. And I think it's something that we would certainly try to incorporate. The issues that the data from those are from the statutory agencies, Environment Agency in England, of course. So the conversation there is slightly different. But I think, yes, very much in scope as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks, Nick. And just before James come in as well, Teresa has pointed out that WEBS is obviously a freshwater and marine scheme. So thank you, James.
Yeah, and just to flag up, WEBS definitely, and also the wetland breeding bird survey. So the kind of waterways breeding bird survey, the equivalent we've got of BBS, but for riparian habitats, and it's certainly something that I think we'd be keen to consider as part of future years of the kind of TSDA work plan is doing something integrative with respect to the kind of freshwater environment. So that's a very good comment, I think.
Thank you all. I mean, this has been answered, but I think it's worth saying it out loud so that anybody who's not got the Jamboard can hear it, which is the three challenges, Michael, that you brought up, can can they diverge, or should they apply to a particular initiative? And Michael, I assume it was you who wrote that reply. I don't know if you
Yes, yeah. We wanted to try and bring together all of these different activities. That it can look like there's a really wide range of stuff going on, but we wanted to say, well, actually, there are some challenges under which these activities fit. We're not expecting that each activity will always hit all three, but definitely each activity that we do will definitely fit under at least one of those, and probably cut across into others.
Great, thanks. And then there was a few comments and interest in thinking about the dealing with uneven spatial coverage introduction. So I won't say this all out loud, but we will pass them on. But then and then the same for thinking around Northern Ireland work. In terms of thinking about the developing communication to improve stakeholder confidence in TEPoP data and trends, again, there are a couple of folk who've expressed interest, but also there's a question around if there's any budget for participants in helping to develop the template. Nikki?
There could potentially be. It would depend on the sort of magnitude of input. There is a certain amount of budget included within all of our scheme partners for engagement with TSDA work, I know, but depending on sort of unique roles and things, we can have those discussions if it's pushing people's capacity too much. It also depends slightly on how substantial a document this sort of communicating bias document is, I think, in terms of how much of an onerous task it is to fill it in. But again, sort of participating in discussions about that can help to shape what it might look like. I don't know if Paul wants to say any more about that.
I don't think so. That was pretty much what I was going to say as well, really.
Great, thanks both. Always good to be on the same page. Then there is one question around the scenarios for the bending the curve work. Wondering if there was a connection made with the AMP integrated modelling platform that has been used, and I can see Nick is nodding. So the answer to that being yes. Was that oh no, and then there's a final comment in the new technologies discussion, which was around the fact that there may be some lessons learned from European initiatives and some just starting. I don't know if the person who wrote that in maybe has a particular thing that they were considering with that comment, but I think Michael, I would suspect that you'd welcome any sort of places of interest that people think would be worth exploring.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm aware of some things that are going on across Europe and globally as well. I may not know the one that this person's thinking about. So yeah, a bit more detail would be great. I don't know if they wanted to say or write on the Jamboard. That's brilliant. Both early on as we're planning stuff, but also as we get into the actual development of things, bringing in as much different expertise as possible would be fabulous. Thank you. And maybe I should say, by bringing in, that's not necessarily people, because this will be focused on not simply technology for biodiversity monitoring, because that has been looked at in quite a few different ways, but it's really bedding it down to what does this mean and what could this mean for our schemes within the UK and the way in which we're operating.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just having a quick look in the chat to see there are a few people talking about the different ways in which freshwater is included within their schemes, and then David has just made a comment about the fact that there's huge interest in citizen science monitoring and water quality as well. So yeah, and we're asking about whether they should extend their activities into biodiversity. It might be quite an interesting thing to discuss. Michael, you have your hand.
Yeah, and I think David may well have picked up on this as well. I think it's really fascinating because you'll tend to get the sorts of recorders which will often deal with sorts of volunteers will tend to be, this is a generalization, but tend to be more interested in taxa and probably exploring over space. Whereas I think things like the freshwater monitoring often tap into that sense of place, which is really strong for people. So they will be interested in their water body or their particular bit of the river, and then might be interested in exploring, recording different things within there. I know that's a gross generalization, and you get patch watchers in different places as well, in terrestrial environments as well. But I think it's then really interesting to be thinking about that in the context of the schemes that we've got and how we support them, and also the motivations of volunteers. So bringing that front and centre to what we're thinking about in TSDA. But thanks, yes. David.
Yeah, and opportunities, I suppose, to steer motivation as well. Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael. Nikki.
I was just going to add to that because I think, yes, when the original point about freshwater was raised, I was thinking more around the sort of water quality, what's in the water type monitoring. So absolutely don't want to dismiss all the schemes that already monitor things associated with freshwater. But I think as we've got quite a lot of thinking in JNCC going on around that, what Michael's just drawn out around that sort of local monitoring scale. And I think a big sort of line of thought there is how we might be getting those sort of crossovers between different people monitoring different things, but in a complementary way to a sort of broader scale. So I think it's definitely will be on the radar for consideration, either within TSDA or more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, in terms of yeah, and David's pointed out that some people can't see the chat, so we will make sure we keep a record. But having a wee look up the chat, there aren't any further questions. But I think also with that in mind, it'd be useful if we could send around the survey that Paula shared about using surveillance scheme data in Northern Ireland, and then also actually the link, Nikki, to the upcoming event on the 21st, just for those who can't see the chat.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, we'll circulate that round to the bulletin mailing list. So yes, if you're not on the bulletin mailing list, then shout, because you might not get it then. But yeah. Yes, we will send everything round.